For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses, into the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the same spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered over the desert. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfilment of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. Therefore, my dear friends, free from adultery, I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one loaf. Consider the people of Israel. Do not those who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar? Do I mean then that a sacrifice offered to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, and I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If some unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if anyone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, both for the sake of the man who told you and for the conscience sake. The other man's conscience, I mean, not yours. For why should my freedom be judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everybody in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example as I followed the example of Christ.
Well, when we look around the church today and the wider Christian community, it's very obvious that while some churches seem to be going rather well and they look to be proclaiming the gospel faithfully by taking its message out to the world and seeing people respond to that message that they're taking out there, it's also obvious, unfortunately, that many churches today seem to have lost something over time, and it's hard to see what gospel they are actually proclaiming. That whilst they do seem to get a response to what they're saying, it seems that what they teach and how they conduct themselves and what people believe in those churches is very far from what is seen in the early church. We've seen many churches today that whilst they may have tremendous growth, well, the church could also be full of scoundrels and false teaching. We see that many in those churches seem to have very little biblical knowledge and also seem to be living for the very things that Jesus said not to live for. And most of the time when there is a Christian, say in the media, and they're being interviewed in a news program, or they're contributing in some way to like a documentary or something like that, they're there to explain a Christian point of view on matters and speaking about what the church's role is in the world. Well, you listen to what they have to say, and unfortunately, more often than not, you'll probably be left wondering and asking the question, what Bible are they reading from? Because nothing that they're claiming seems to fit with what we know to be true Christian teaching. They'll say, this is what is expected of the church, or that the church has no concern over these matters, or perhaps even supports such a cause. And it's hard to understand how they have come to hold such a belief when it does not seem to fit with God's word. We see that everything from marriage equality to abortion and even salvation being said that it being there for all people, no matter what religion or faith they might hold to. You hear what they say about these matters, and you think about the passages that you yourself have read. And when you compare them, you can't help but wonder how they've actually come to reach such a position. What could have happened that left them saying, I'm a Christian, and yet everything about my life actually says the opposite of that claim. Everything I teach is the opposite of what I claim. Because they seem to believe something very different to what the church has believed and held to for really the last 2,000 years. And that's why it leaves us asking the question, why or how have they come to such a position? And the reason for this actually gets brought out in this chapter. This passage here says both why this happens, as well as also telling us what we can do to make sure that we don't make their mistake. How we can actually keep ourselves in line with the truth and make sure that we don't get caught up in such worldly ideas that leads us to act and believe in a way that is actually going against everything that Jesus stood for. So the first thing we see in this passage is that it starts off with Paul saying, I do not want you to be ignorant. Now, this is something Paul uses a lot in his letters. He's used it more than once in Romans and 1 Thessalonians, and he'll use it again in this very letter, in chapter 12 of this letter, as well as in the second letter of Corinthians. So this shows up quite often, and it's a way for him to introduce an important topic that's often linking back to his last point before it. So last week we looked at chapter 9, and his big point there was not to be disqualified from the prize. That we are to keep our eye on the goal, what we're trying to reach and achieve, so as to therefore not be led astray. And now we're seeing really what that goal is, what it is that we are here for, and what it is that we should be wanting to achieve. And Paul shows this by speaking of events that happened in Israel's past, where God had done something for them, but then they made the mistake of doing something that would then take them off the goal, what they were actually supposed to be living for. So he says in verses 1 to 4, he says, our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink. So what Paul is clearly talking about here is the events in the Exodus, coming out of Egypt, where Moses was chosen to lead the Israelites out of slavery and into the promised land. And he's saying that they were at that time united with Moses in this, as they went through the same trials together. But despite all that they witnessed and all that they experienced, all that God had given them, they didn't remain faithful. Instead, not only did they not remain faithful, they actually rebelled against Moses and against God as they took their eyes off the goal, and they were therefore disqualified. They messed up, and therefore they missed out in a way that is the same as the very thing that Paul was warning about in the chapter before this one. So he says here in verse 5 that even though Moses led them out of Egypt and that they were with him, that nevertheless God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So this is where we see that they took this journey out of Egypt to this promised land that really should have taken them, we read in Deuteronomy, 11 days. But it ended up taking them 40 years. And none but 2 of them actually got to enter the promised land. And this is because they'd been so rebellious towards God after he had saved them that he wouldn't allow them to receive the prize. And this is what makes the basis for Paul's argument here. And the argument that we're going to see in our second point this morning. But before we get there, there are a couple of things worth noting just in these first 5 verses. For one, he says, our ancestors. That the people he's talking to are really descendants of these people who made this mistake 1,500 years earlier. And of course, this raises a question, because as we know, it would actually be impossible for them to be the direct descendants. Because he's not writing to a church here that's in Jerusalem or perhaps another Jewish city. Because this has been pointed out a number of times during this sermon series, Corinth is very much a Gentile city. And it's a city that has a lot of Greek customs and cultural sins, as we've been looking at. So how can he say that our ancestors, who were Israelites, if he is speaking to what are Gentiles and, well, Greeks? And the reason is because the church is a continuation of Israel. The body of Christ is the true Israel. They are all one as God's people. There isn't this disconnect between Israel and the church, as if God gave up on the Jews and then moved on to someone else. The plan was always for the entire world to be blessed through Abraham. So we are the descendants today, even if it's not by Jewish blood. And this is something Paul explains in his letter to the Galatians. After saying to them that some have made the mistake of going back to Jewish ways and going back to the law and depending on that to save them. And how even Peter and Barnabas had been tricked into eating with only the circumcised Jews. And that they were avoiding the Gentiles as they had fallen back into these old Jewish customs. Well, after rebuking them for this mistake, he then says in Galatians 3, and this is verses 7 to 9 of that letter, understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham, all nations will be blessed through you. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. So Paul spells out there in that letter what is actually being talked about here. That those who have faith in Christ, well, they are the descendants of the Israelites in Egypt. Not always by blood, although some of them would be biologically connected if they were in fact Jewish. But all Christians, all of us in the church, even today, we are God's people. We are the unfolding part of God's plan for the world. And we are separated, we're aliens from those of this world. And how this all works, what makes this connection from us today to them back then, well, this comes out even clearer when we look at the part of the passage that was skipped before. I read out verses 1 to 5 a moment ago, except for the very last bit of verse 4, which says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. So Christ was with them back then. He was very much at work in the 12 tribes and the nation of Israel, just as he's at work in the world today, and the church is his body. We are his people. So they were his people. We are his people. We are all God's people who have been set apart for him. Which is what makes the next part of this passage here so important for us today. Because after establishing this connection that we have with the Israelites, well, Paul is now going to elaborate on what he said a moment ago about how God was not pleased with them. So he left them in the wilderness and they missed the prize. Because what Paul's now going to argue is that what happened to them back then, this is an example for us now, so as to not make the same mistakes. For us to see where it is that they went wrong, so we don't then make the same error and then we get disqualified, as was warned about last week. And we see what Paul is going to, how he's going to argue this by showing a couple of reasons as to why we have no excuse if we do in fact make this same kind of mistake. How these errors back then should help guide us today to remain faithful to him now. So the first reason given here is the one that was mentioned just a moment ago. That they, back then, are an example for us now. So he says clearly in verse 6, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And then again, in verse 11, he says pretty much the same thing. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us. So what happened back then? When you open up the Old Testament and you open up those first few books, what was happening back then and what happened throughout the nation of Israel, it's actually for us today. Their failure to honour God and glorify God and their desire for evil, well, that shows what happens when we take our eyes off the prize and we fall back into sin. And Paul gives some specific examples of things that happened in the Old Testament Israelite community that we must not repeat in the church now. So he says in verse 7 of our passage here, he says, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. So this is referring to the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, where if you remember that story, they made a calf out of gold, called it the God who saved them from the Egyptians, and then got up the next day and had this festival to worship this calf that they had made. So there's one simple lesson being given here, which is don't worship idols. And don't give to an idol the thanks and the glory that belongs to God alone. And as we keep moving on in the passage, in verse 8 we then read this. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. So this is now referring to an event in Numbers 25, where the men went out and had relations with the Moabite women, made sacrifices to their gods, and started worshipping Baal. And as a consequence of this, a plague was sent on them, and thousands of them died. They brought this destruction upon themselves by worshipping false gods and by their immorality. So we see that by their constant sin, the fact that they kept worshipping idols and false gods, it took their eyes off the true God and it only brought upon them destruction. And this is why Paul was saying today, you have no excuse if you do the same thing, because they have shown where that behaviour leads. So if you today, right now in the 21st century, if you have an affair or give in to drunkenness or get caught up in worldliness and the idols of our world today, then don't be surprised if you end up like them. They have shown us where such behaviour leads. So we today have no excuse if we claim we don't know what the consequences of sin is. So today you don't need to stick a knife in a PowerPoint to know what happens, because other people have unfortunately already done that, and we can actually learn from their errors. And it's actually the same thing with what's going on here. When you give into sin, when you fall into idolatry, when you mix in with the things of this world, and you don't keep yourself pure, and don't keep your focus on God, and when you give glory to something other than to God, well, then things will never work out for you. And we know it won't work out for us, because you only have to look back to Israel to see how it worked out for them when they did those things. But then after making that point, Paul then goes on to say that not only did they do the wrong thing by sinning so foolishly, but by doing this, they were actually tempting God. They were putting the Lord to the test. And this is where the real issue comes in, because doing such a thing shows the lack of respect and love that they actually had for the Lord. And he gives another list of examples here that shows how they did this and why it is such an issue. So, moving further down in our passage, this is what Paul has to say in verses 9 and 10. He says, "We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and they were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel." And we see in these examples in books like Exodus, where Moses says to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" And we see it again in Numbers 21, that they kept complaining and rebelling against God. So he sent snakes to stop them. That they had again tested the Lord, even whilst they're walking around in the wilderness, because of the last time they had tested the Lord. So they put the Lord to the test, the very thing that they've been told not to do, and that is the price that they paid. This is the consequences of doing such a thing. And when we look at the Old Testament, we see the kind of mentality that the Israelites had. And it's very comparable to the kind of mentality that we probably all had at one point, and we still see in the world today. Because the Israelites were like a kid, often seeing how far they could push their parents or their teacher before they would cross the line. So they were essentially asking, every time they rebelled, how much can I get away with? It's basically like running the orange light just before it turns red type stuff, right? Just walking the edge to see where that edge is. How far can you push things? And this is why when Christians today excuse their behaviour, they excuse sinful behaviour by saying, it's not lust, it's just admiration. Or, I'm not drunk, I'm just tipsy, right? I'm happy. That kind of stuff, it's seeing how far you can push the envelope before there are consequences. How far can you go? And what Paul is saying here is, don't test the Lord. Don't see how far you can go. He's saying, learn from the Israelites and run from sin. Don't be like them. Live for the Lord, not your desires. Because if you do, their example back then means that we actually have no excuse today. Again, they've shown us how this will end for us. Which then leads to the second thing in this section, which is that if you say make that first mistake of worshipping idols and giving into sin, and that by doing so, you're putting the Lord to the test by rebelling against him and walking on the edge. If you've not learnt from the mistake of the Israelites, you can't then excuse your behaviour by blaming God. You can't say it's his fault for your weakness by claiming that he had put you in a bad situation. See, when you look at original sin, when you go back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, when they ate the fruit from the tree, when that happened, the first thing that the woman did after doing what God had told her not to do, she said, it's the serpent's fault. Right? She passed the blame onto someone or something else. Right? She knew it was wrong, but she did it anyway. So it's not like she didn't know. It's not like she didn't know she was going against God's rules when she did this act. She knew exactly what she was doing, but when she got caught, she blamed someone else. And this is not a mentality that has actually gone away. Right? People throughout history have said, the devil made me do it. And people today will say that their childhood or society structures are to blame for their bad behaviour. So it's common for people when they are in the wrong, even if they know they're in the wrong, to look for an excuse for that behaviour. They blame someone else for their bad choices. But what we also see in the garden is that when Adam sinned, when he ate the fruit, he actually goes one step further. Because when he was asked by God, why did he do this? He said, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. So we see here, he's not only blaming her, which he is. But he's also basically saying, God, it's your fault for putting her in the garden with me. The woman you put here caused me to do this. And people today, we see, are still quick to blame God when things go wrong. Something bad happens. A murder, a war, people even playing around with viruses in a lab. Or perhaps maybe something even more common, something that we've all witnessed or experienced. Like someone gossiping about another person or bullying someone and causing broken relationships and even perhaps driving people to breaking point by that kind of behaviour. When people do these bad things and people get hurt and it causes issues and it causes all these problems in our society, it's not uncommon for people to then say, well, where is God? If God was so loving and so good, why did he let all these bad things happen? See, people often blame God for the issues in the world today and for the mistakes that they make, and blame him for the consequences and the hurt that comes from their sin that causes those issues. Because it is easier to do that than to face the fact that we cause our own problems. That the bad things that happen, they come about when people give in to their sinful desires and then act on those desires. But what Paul is saying here is, if you've given to sin, if you've given in to temptation, well, it's not God's fault. It's not his fault that you couldn't say no to these things. So he says in verses 12 and 13, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. So what Paul's saying here is, whatever temptation you're facing, it's nothing that others haven't faced before. That yes, Corinth is a shocking place. Yes, it's a city where anything goes. But even what's going on in that city is nothing new. And others have said no to the sin that's going on in that city. And Paul himself has been to Corinth. He spent a considerable amount of time in Corinth, and he didn't give in to it. And there are obviously other members of the church there who are not fallen into the sins of that city. So the ones that do have no excuse. They can't turn around and say, well, God, this is your fault. And this is why he goes on to say, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So you can't turn around and blame God. You can't say, hey, God, you put me in this city with a temple to Aphrodite. And it's not my fault I went up there. It's yours for putting me in this situation. So it's a foolish excuse, especially when you consider that not everyone is going up there. Some people do say no. And if they can control themselves, then so can you. And it's also the same today. Not everyone who goes to the pub comes home drunk. Not everyone who goes to a sports match loses all their money on betting. Others do say no to these temptations. God has given us the ability to do that. So if you give in, then it is on you. So there are the two reasons given here for why there is no excuse for sin. That we have had the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of our ancestors, from the mistakes that the Israelites made. That when we look at their times of testing the Lord and letting sin rule their life, then we can see that that behaviour always led to destruction. So don't us now start doing the same thing. Don't us make the mistake that they made. But also, that if we do make that kind of mistake, if we do give in temptation, then we only have ourselves to blame. God does not force us to sin. He is not to blame for our choices. If we don't learn from the mistakes of those in the past, then we are responsible for the sin we commit and whatever the results of that sin might lead to. Which is why when we move into the next part of the passage, we see the warning given here to make sure that we're keeping ourselves separate from those very things that would lead us into such sin. We see that Paul starts with verse 14 by saying simply, "Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry." So as said before, we're not to see how close we can get to the edge. That when you see a live wire, you don't see how close you can get your hand to it before you get zapped. Instead, the sensible thing to do is to stay away from danger. When you see warning signs, you step back. And the warning sign and knowing when to adhere to it is the kind of example that Paul gives here. See, one of the things some of us looked at in our Connect groups just a few weeks ago was his argument in chapter 8 about food sacrificed to idols. And back then his argument was that if you go to the market and buy food, and that food comes from the leftovers from some sacrifice somewhere, you're free to eat it. You're free to eat it because you know that these idols and false gods are simply that, they're false. You know that none of that means anything. So you're free to eat it because it's only food. And what someone else thinks of it, well, that doesn't matter because it's not being given to a real God. Now, of course, he does say, as he's explaining this, that if eating it causes a weaker brother to sin, if someone feels uncomfortable and guilty about eating it, don't do it. Right? For their sake, don't eat it. But if you know that it means nothing, and you're just eating it because it's only food, well, just do it. Don't worry about it. And now we see he makes a very similar argument here. This is not too different to chapter 8. He's actually making some of the same points again. So he says in verse 19, "Do I mean that the food sacrificed to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything?" So again, here he is saying that these things aren't real. These false gods aren't important. So food sacrificed to them doesn't mean anything, so you can eat it. And he spells this out in verses 25 and 26. He says, "Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it." So he's saying you're free to eat this food. As long as you know it means nothing and you're not causing others to stumble, it doesn't matter. But we see here that he also argues that there is a time and place to walk away. That there are times that we need to not do this because it does cause an issue of idolatry and we could be sinning if we do eat it. That we need to see the warning sign, to see the live wire and get as far away from it as possible. Because he also says in verses 27 and 28, "If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, 'This has been offered in sacrifice,' then do not eat it." And the reason for this, it was already given above. First, because of what he says in verse 20, the sacrifice of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. And he's saying this in light of the Lord's Supper. So to make it clear, what he's saying here is, you can't come to church, eat the bread and drink the wine, which is the body and blood of Christ, then head up to the temple, and then just go along with whatever they do. Do what is their equivalent of communion. He's saying you can't do that because this stuff that they do is essentially satanic. It's one thing to eat food that's left over from their ritual, to just buy some at the market and then just cook it up and eat it, that's fine. But it's another thing altogether to participate in this, to be a part of it, to be a part of offering the food to this idol. See, it's like today. Today a Christian is free to walk into a mosque, right? You can go into one and it doesn't mean that you believe what they believe. And you can go into a shop and buy some halal food and it doesn't matter, right? You can eat it. If you know that none of it matters, that you don't believe in any of this stuff, then you're free to be there, you're free to eat this stuff. It's not you giving glory to these things. And all of these things change you because you know it's all false. You know it doesn't mean anything. It's just food that God has created. But if you go into a mosque Well, don't get down on the mat and start bowing in prayer to Allah. Right? There's a big difference between simply going, I care nothing for this, it's all wrong, and actively being a participant in it. Actually being a part of the ceremony and worshipping a false god. For us, our worship is for Christ and Christ alone. So we can't participate in the religions of the world because they're opposed to the very gospel that we believe in. To put it simply, you can't dance with the devil. You have to say that this stuff is wrong and you've got to stay away from it and not give it any value. But also the reason why we have to avoid such things is what we already looked at in the earlier part of this passage this morning. That this is actually what the Israelites did. They got close to the edge and some of them fell over. Some of them got too close to that live wire and they got a good shock. They fell into idolatry. They made the mistake of playing around with these demons and essentially trying to worship two things. They lived by a law that showed that they worshipped God. And then they followed foreign gods. And they allowed their camp and their land to be filled with idols to them. As I said before, they literally made a calf out of gold and then praised it for what God had done for them. So as we looked at, their mistake of doing these things, it's a warning to us. They have shown what happens when you try to mix these things. They've shown how idolatry will lead us away from God as we'll start to live for these false gods and the things of this world and no longer live for the true God. And that doing such things is putting the Lord to the test because it's almost daring him to take action. It's doing the very thing that he says not to do and seeing how far you can go before he says you've crossed the line. Which means that the message of this passage is to make sure that whatever you do it for God. And that you don't let these practices of the world slip into your life as they only corrupt the heart. We see in verses 23 and 24 that Paul repeats something he said to them back in chapter 6. He quotes them and the attitude they have, and he adds to it by showing how that whilst what they say is right and is in fact true, they are running the same risk as those back in Israel if they become arrogant in this way of thinking. So he says to them here, he says, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. See, what they're saying is true, and possibly already just repeating the kind of stuff that Paul and others have actually taught them. That you can do anything because you are saved by faith, not by works. So they are free to do what they want. But they're free as only as far as they're not sinning. They're free only if it's not a rejection of the gospel and a form of idolatry. So if you know that the food on the plate is probably what's left from some sacrifice to a god that doesn't even exist, then sure, you can eat it. You have the right to do that. You are free. If you're strong in your mind and faith, and you're convinced that it means nothing, then that's fine. But as he also says here, not everything is beneficial. Not everything is constructive. So whilst you may be free to do something, if there's a possibility that it harms your faith, or if it damages the ministry, or if it leads others astray, then don't do it. And that's why he goes on to say, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So the main point there is, your liberty has to end when it has a negative impact on the church and those in it. And of course, knowing when to draw that line, well, that takes discernment. To know, is this a good idea or not? Is my freedom here going to lead to other problems? Asking that question, is eating this food a good idea? Is going to this place a good idea? Just the same way we today might have to ask similar questions. Is watching this movie that I'm free to do a good idea? Is wearing these clothes a good idea? Is maybe just skipping church this Sunday a good idea? Asking yourself, is it constructive and beneficial for others? Or is it just making a statement that you can do whatever you want, as we now have the freedom in Christ to do what we want? And whilst it can be hard to know where this line is, well, Paul ends this chapter with the only way to actually measure these things, the way we actually can make this decision. So starting down in verse 31, he says, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God." See, there is the test. That's what you've got to ask yourself about everything, as it will stop you from falling into idolatry as those in Israel did. So that choice that you have to eat that food, if you do, you ask the question, is it for the glory of God? That choice that you have to go to that place, if you go, is it for the glory of God? That choice you have to listen to that song, is it for the glory of God? See, when you look at your decisions and then ask that question, is it for the glory of God? The answer to that question will make that decision for you. You can avoid idolatry. You can avoid the mistake that those in Israel made by asking that simple question before you even start. Is this for the glory of God, or is it for another reason? And on top of that, making sure we ask ourselves that question. Well, Paul goes on to say, "Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved." See, on top of asking, is it for the glory of God, is also the question of, will this benefit others and benefit the church or not? If yes, if all the answers are yes, it's for the glory of God and the benefits of the church, then you're free to do it. If not, don't do it. It's as simple as that. Paul's simply saying, if we focus on what is right, well, the same kind of mistakes that the Israelites made won't happen for us. That if God's glory is our focus, we'll not make the wrong choice, because we'll stay as far away from the things that could cause damage by making sure we're only focused on Him and Him alone. So you look at any scandal happening in a church. You look at any time a church forgets the gospel or where Christians go off the rails, and you always see a similar pattern. In churches, idolatry comes in many different ways. For example, leader worship, where for some in the church, the pastor becomes more important than God. Obsession with church music, where it's all about the performance and not the one that we're actually singing to. When there's too much focus on entertainment, when it's all about fun and the big events, a problem that often shows itself in youth ministries. You look at how other churches have got into worldly issues. They spend all their time talking about climate change and equality, and that these things basically becomes their worship because they never actually talk about Jesus anymore. And they get caught up in these things because they don't ask, is it for God's glory? They don't ask, do others benefit from this, or is it a hindrance and a stumbling block? And what may have been a small thing at the start and not too big of an issue, well, it can lead the church astray over time as it becomes an idol for those in the church to worship. Because they no longer do everything for the glory of God. But instead, over time, He gets forgotten. And the same thing happens with people's personal faith. You let one little thing slip after another. You start doing the things that you wouldn't have ever done a year ago. Or perhaps you stop doing the good things that you always used to do. And before you know it, you are very far from God, as you no longer do everything for His glory, but for your own sinful desires. So that's the answer to the question at the start. At the start when I said, why or how do these churches come to the position that they've come to? How do these people come to believe these things which are so far from the Bible? How do they get to a point where they call themselves Christians still, yet they seem so far away from having a godly, biblical view of the world? Well, this is how. This is how it happens. It happens by testing the Lord, seeing how close they can get to the edge, idolizing worldly things and forgetting God in the process. But if you always ask yourself the question, before you even start, is this what I'm doing? Is this for God's glory? Then you can stop such errors from pulling you away. As Jesus prayed on the night just before he was crucified, he said to his Father in heaven, I've brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you have given me to do. And we see by that prayer that this is what drove Jesus. It was to bring glory to his Father, bring glory to him. And doing that guided Jesus every moment he was on earth. And then look at how Paul finishes our passage today. Going into the start of chapter 11, he says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And that's what he's talking about. Giving God all glory. That's how you avoid the mistake that the Israelites made. How you avoid the mistake that many in Corinth are making. And the mistake that many in the church in our world today keep making. You avoid all that by making sure that in everything you do it for God's glory, as that is what we have been created for.